On a quiet Tuesday morning in a small Georgia town, the air still smelling of pine and fresh-cut grass, a woman named Tracy Roberson lay dying on the floor of her own bedroom, the bedroom she had shared with her husband for over a decade. The husband who had stood at an altar before God and congregation and sworn to love and protect her. The same husband who now stood over her with a smoking gun. He was a pastor, a man who had preached love, mercy, and forgiveness every single Sunday for years, a man whose congregation trusted him with their most vulnerable confessions, a man who smiled from the pulpit and quoted scripture and counseled grieving families through the worst moments of their lives. And yet, when police finally arrived at the Roberson home, they found 15 shell casings scattered across the floor like a grotesque trail of breadcrumbs. They found blood soaked into the carpet. They found a woman who had been shot so many times investigators would later struggle to form a coherent sequence of events. They also found something else. Something that would stun even the most hardened detectives on the force. Across town, in a damp backyard barely large enough to fit a lawn chair, an 11-year-old girl crouched motionless beneath a blue plastic tarp. She had been hiding there for hours. She was cold, she was terrified, and she had just watched her mother be murdered. But here is where the story fractures into something investigators never saw coming. Because that little girl under the tarp, she wasn't hiding from a killer. She was hiding because she had just killed her own mother. 2 murders, 2 weapons, 2 completely separate crimes, 2 shattered families, all connected by a thread so thin, so ugly, so deeply personal that the investigators who worked this case would later say they had never seen anything like it. To understand how we got here, to the shell casings, to the tarp, to the blood, we have to go back to the beginning, back to a church, back to a marriage, back to the secrets people keep when they believe no one is watching. If you want to uncover more chilling true crime stories and see justice exposed, subscribe to Crime Vaults as we bring light to the darkest true crime cases and never miss the secrets hidden in plain sight. Thomas Roberson, Tommy to those who knew him, was by every visible measure exactly what a pastor was supposed to be. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of warm, authoritative voice that fills a room without effort. He had grown up attending the same church where he would later become head pastor. He had married his high school sweetheart, Tracy Lynn Crawford, in a ceremony attended by nearly 300 people. He coached Little League. He organized food drives. He remembered the names of every family in his congregation, including their children and grandchildren. People in Hargrove County, Georgia, did not just respect Thomas Roberson, they adored him. And Tracy? Tracy Roberson was the kind of woman who made everything look effortless. She taught 3rd grade at the local elementary school. She organized the church's women's ministry. She baked for every bake sale, stayed late for every meeting, and somehow found time to run every morning, 6 days a week before the sun was fully up. Together, Thomas and Tracy Roberson were the couple everyone pointed to as a model, the couple that made other couples feel both inspired and slightly inadequate. But inside that beautiful picture frame, inside the church, the morning runs, and the perfectly maintained home, something was rotting. Something Thomas Roberson had been trying to ignore for months. It had started, according to testimony that would later emerge in court, with something small, something private, something Tracy had probably never intended for her husband to notice at all. She had been exercising at home one evening, stretching on the bedroom floor after her run, when Thomas, sitting nearby, noticed something that made him pause. An odor, an unusual odor. Now, in the hands of a loving and rational husband, this might have prompted a quiet, private conversation, a gentle suggestion to see a doctor, an expression of concern, maybe a bit of embarrassment on both sides, the way ordinary couples navigate the unglamorous parts of intimacy. Thomas Roberson did none of those things. Instead, he became consumed by a suspicion, a dark, obsessive, irrational suspicion that would grow like a tumor over the next several weeks. He became convinced without a single shred of evidence, without asking Tracy a single direct question, that his wife was having an affair, that the odor was proof of infidelity, that the woman he had married, the woman who woke up at 5 in the morning to run and then came home to make breakfast and get their kids off to school, was secretly sleeping with another man. He began monitoring her phone, watching who she talked to, timing her runs, checking her mileage. He found nothing, because there was nothing to find. Medical professionals would later note that the odor Thomas described, the one that had ignited this entire catastrophic spiral, was almost certainly the symptom of a common and very treatable gynecological condition called bacterial vaginosis. It affects millions of women. It is not a sign of infidelity. It is not a sign of anything except a minor pH imbalance that a brief course of antibiotics typically resolves entirely. Thomas Roberson, the man who counseled others through their crises, who quoted scripture about the dangers of false witness, never once considered that possibility. The obsession deepened, the surveillance intensified, and somewhere in the dark, cluttered interior of Thomas Roberson's mind, a decision was slowly taking shape, one that Tracy Roberson never saw coming. The morning of March 14th began the way most mornings in the Roberson household began. Tracy was up before dawn. She pulled on her running clothes in the half-dark, not wanting to wake Thomas. She stretched in the bedroom, the same stretch routine she had done hundreds of times before. She laced her shoes. She was out the door by 5:47, according to the timestamp on a neighbor's security camera that happened to face the street. She ran her usual route, 3 miles, through the neighborhood, past the elementary school where she taught, and back again. She was home by 6:23. Thomas was awake, sitting in the kitchen, waiting. What happened in the next 4 minutes, investigators would piece together largely from physical evidence, from shell casings, from blood spatter analysis, from the position of the body, and from a single brief phone call Thomas made to his brother immediately afterward, in which he said only 4 words: "I think I snapped." Tracy Roberson was shot 15 times. The first shot came from close range, close enough that forensics found stippling, the tiny abrasion marks that gunpowder leaves on skin when a weapon is fired nearby. She had not had time to run. She had not had time to fight back in any meaningful way. She had been caught completely off guard in her own home. She was still wearing her running shoes when she died. Thomas Roberson walked out of his house, got into his car, and drove away. He did not call 911. He did not check whether Tracy had survived. He did not call the hospital. He drove to his brother's house, where he would be found 3 hours later, still holding the gun, sitting in the passenger seat of a parked car with the engine off, staring at nothing. When deputies arrived and asked him what had happened, Thomas Roberson, the pastor, the beloved community figure, the man known for his eloquence and his warm, steady voice, said only, "She was dirty." Investigators stood there in the driveway of a quiet suburban house on a Tuesday morning, looking at a man who had just shot his wife 15 times, and those were the words they got. 2 words, as if they explained everything, as if they explained anything at all. But even as detectives were processing what they had just heard, even as crime scene technicians were moving through the Roberson home and the local police department was beginning what they expected to be a fairly straightforward domestic homicide investigation, 47 miles away, in the neighboring town of Maryville, another 911 call was being logged. And it would change everything. The 911 call from Maryville came in at 9:47 in the morning. A neighbor on Carver Lane reported a bad smell coming from the house next door, the Hendricks house. She had not seen Linda Hendricks in 2 days, which was unusual. Linda was the type of woman who was always outside, weeding her garden, talking over the fence, waving from her driveway. 2 days of silence from Linda Hendricks was enough to make her neighbor pick up the phone. Officers arrived within 12 minutes. They found Linda Hendricks in her kitchen, dead. She had been stabbed multiple times. The house showed no signs of forced entry. Nothing of value appeared to be missing. There was no evidence of a break-in, no evidence of a struggle in any other room of the house. The crime scene pointed clearly to someone Linda had let inside, someone she knew, someone she had no reason to be afraid of. Officers began canvassing the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking questions. One neighbor remembered seeing Linda's daughter, 11-year-old Cassidy Hendricks, playing in the backyard the previous afternoon. Had anyone seen Cassidy since then? Was the child safe? Where was she? The search for Cassidy Hendricks lasted 4 hours. They found her in the backyard of a house 3 doors down. She was curled beneath a heavy blue plastic tarp that had been pulled off a woodpile and dragged into the corner between a fence and a garden shed. She had covered herself completely. She was shivering. She had not eaten. When officers gently pulled back the tarp, Cassidy did not run. She did not scream. She looked up at them with eyes that seemed simultaneously ancient and utterly hollow, and she said, "Is my mom going to be okay?" The officers exchanged a look over the child's head, a look that carries with it all the weight of a question they could not yet answer, because they didn't yet know for certain what had happened. They didn't yet know that the blood on Cassidy's sleeves was her mother's. They didn't yet know that the kitchen knife that had killed Linda Hendricks had been wiped clean and placed back in the drawer. They didn't yet know that Cassidy had done it, and they definitely didn't yet know why. To understand what drove an 11-year-old child to kill her own mother, investigators had to first understand what life inside the Hendricks house actually looked like. From the outside, Linda Hendricks was a single mother doing her best. She worked evenings at a restaurant on Route 9, came home late, slept in on weekends. She was not particularly warm with neighbors, but she was not hostile either. She existed on the edges of the community, present but not embedded, known but not truly known. Cassidy had no father in the picture, no siblings, no extended family nearby. It was just the two of them in that house on Carver Lane, a mother and a daughter, alone. What was happening behind that closed door had been invisible to almost everyone. Teachers at Cassidy's school had filed concern reports twice, noting unexplained bruising on the child's arms and a withdrawal from other students that had grown noticeably worse over the past year. Child Protective Services had made 2 visits to the Hendricks home. Both times Linda had been present, composed, and plausible. Both visits were closed without action. What those CPS workers had not seen, what no one had seen, was the specific horror of what Cassidy's life had become in the months before her mother's death. Investigators would later uncover journal entries Cassidy had hidden inside a hollowed-out book in her bedroom closet. The entries, written in a child's careful, deliberate handwriting, the letters formed with the painstaking effort of someone who had just learned cursive, described a level of violence that was difficult to read. Beatings with a belt, being locked in a bathroom for days at a time, being denied food, being told repeatedly and in specific detail that she was worthless, unwanted, and that the world would be better without her. And then there was the entry dated 3 days before Linda's death. In it, Cassidy wrote that her mother had threatened to kill her. Not in the vague, unspecific way that abusive parents sometimes speak in the heat of rage. Cassidy wrote that her mother had told her, calmly, deliberately, while holding a knife, that she had decided Cassidy was more trouble than she was worth, and that she was going to fix that. The entry ended with 5 words that would haunt every person who read it. I think she means it this time. 2 days later, Linda Hendricks was dead, and Cassidy was hiding under a tarp, shivering, asking if her mother was okay. Because even after everything, even after every bruise and every locked door and every night without food and every cruel, cutting word, Cassidy still loved her mother. She had not wanted her mother to die. She had wanted her mother to stop. She had just run out of any other way to make that happen. At first glance, the Roberson murder and the Hendricks murder appeared to have nothing in common. Different towns, different victims, different weapons, different circumstances entirely. But investigators are trained to look for the thread, to pull at the loose end of a story until something unravels. And when they began pulling, they found something. Linda Hendricks had, for approximately 8 months, been a member of Thomas Roberson's congregation. She had started attending the church after a coworker invited her. She had come sporadically at first, then more regularly. She had sat in the back row. She had, on one occasion, attended a one-on-one pastoral counseling session with Thomas Roberson himself. The details of that counseling session, what was said, what was shared, were supposed to be confidential, privileged, sacred in every sense of the word. But Thomas Roberson had kept notes, handwritten notes, tucked into a leather-bound journal he kept in his desk at the church office, notes he had taken during multiple counseling sessions with multiple congregants, notes that described the intimate, painful, private confessions of people who had come to their pastor in their most desperate moments. When investigators found that journal, and they found it only because Thomas's brother, horrified by what had happened, told them where to look, they discovered something that reframed the entire investigation. Linda Hendricks had confided in Thomas Roberson about her daughter. She had sat in his office and told him, this man of God, this trusted shepherd, that she was losing control, that she was hurting Cassidy, that she was scared of what she might do. She had asked for help. Thomas Roberson had prayed with her. He had given her scripture. He had told her that God could heal any wound, restore any relationship, transform any heart. He had not reported what she told him to Child Protective Services. In most states, including Georgia, clergy are mandatory reporters. When a pastor, priest, or minister becomes aware of child abuse or a credible threat of child abuse, they are legally obligated to report it to the appropriate authorities immediately. Thomas Roberson had instead recorded it in a personal journal and done nothing. His note on Linda Hendricks' counseling session, written in his own neat, precise handwriting, read, "Linda H., struggling with anger toward her child. Prayed for healing. Will follow up." There was no follow-up entry. He never followed up. 3 months after that session, Linda Hendricks stopped coming to church. 4 months after that, she was dead. And Cassidy Hendricks, the child that Thomas Roberson had been told about, the child he had chosen not to protect, was sitting in a police interview room with dried blood on her sleeves, answering questions from investigators who were trying to understand how an 11-year-old girl had arrived at the most catastrophic decision of her life. The legal proceedings in both cases would take 2 years to fully resolve. Thomas Roberson's trial was, in some respects, the simpler of the two. The physical evidence was overwhelming. The phone call to his brother was devastating. His own statement at the scene, "She was dirty," became the defining phrase of the prosecution's case. His defense team attempted to argue diminished capacity, painting their client as a man driven temporarily insane by jealousy and grief. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They convicted Thomas Roberson of murder in the first degree. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During sentencing, several members of his congregation stood up to speak on his behalf. They described the man they knew, the pastor, the community leader, the counselor, the food drive organizer, the Little League coach. Not one of them seemed to understand that the man they were describing had also, by his inaction, failed a child he could have saved. The prosecution raised the mandatory reporting failure in court, but was unable to directly charge Roberson for it in a way that would carry significant additional penalties given the complexity of demonstrating causation. Whether Cassidy's situation would have been resolved had he reported, given the prior CPS failures. It became instead a moral stain, documented in the court record without a corresponding legal penalty. The Cassidy Hendricks matter was heard in juvenile court, behind closed doors, as Georgia law requires for defendants under the age of 12. Forensic psychologists spent months evaluating Cassidy. What they found was consistent: a child in a state of acute, chronic traumatic stress who had acted out of genuine fear for her life after a direct threat that she had documented in her journal and that physical evidence largely supported. The juvenile court judge, in a ruling that ran to 41 pages, determined that Cassidy Hendricks would not be formally adjudicated delinquent. She was instead placed in a therapeutic residential facility where she would receive comprehensive mental health treatment and education. The judge cited the documented history of severe abuse, the credible and immediate threat to the child's life, and the failure of multiple adult systems, CPS, the church, the school, that had been made aware of Cassidy's situation and had not acted decisively enough to protect her. In the ruling, the judge wrote, "This child did not fall through the cracks. She was dropped." Those 5 words would become the headline in every newspaper that covered the case. Tracy Roberson's 3rd-grade class finished the school year with a substitute teacher. Her students were told only that their teacher had become very sick. Most of them, being 8 years old, accepted this explanation. A few of them, the sharper ones who had older siblings at home with access to the internet, knew more. But children, when surrounded by attentive adults, are surprisingly resilient in the immediate term. The crisis comes later. It always comes later. Tracy's parents, Eugene and Marlene Crawford, attended every day of Thomas Roberson's trial. They sat in the same row every morning. They held each other's hands. They never looked at Thomas Roberson once during the proceedings, not during opening arguments, not during the reading of the forensic evidence, not during sentencing. Eugene Crawford, asked by a reporter outside the courthouse what he wanted people to know about his daughter, thought for a moment, and then said, "She ran every single morning. Rain, cold, it didn't matter. I used to ask her why she worked so hard. And she used to say, 'Because the body is a gift, Dad, and you don't waste a gift.' That's who she was." He paused. He threw that gift away because of a smell, because he was too proud to ask her a question. That's what I'll never get over. She deserved better than a man who was too proud to ask one simple question. The congregation of Thomas Roberson's church dissolved within 6 months of his conviction. Some members joined neighboring churches. Some stopped attending services entirely. A few held small private gatherings in each other's homes for a period of time, trying to hold on to the faith that their pastor had both embodied and obliterated in the span of a single morning. The church building itself was eventually sold to a different denomination. The new congregation repainted the interior, replaced the carpet, and changed the name on the sign out front. They kept the pews. As for Cassidy Hendricks, the details of her placement and her progress in treatment remain sealed under juvenile privacy protections. What is known is that she was eventually moved out of the residential facility and into a foster home, that she continued her education, that she showed what her caseworkers described in a court update as remarkable resilience. What remarkable resilience looks like in a 12-year-old girl who has survived what Cassidy survived and done what Cassidy did is something only she will ever fully understand. The detective who found Cassidy under the tarp, a 14-year veteran of the Maryville Police Department named Raymond Tift, retired 2 years after the case closed. In his retirement speech, he did not tell funny stories from the job. He did not accept the gold watch without emotion. He stood at the podium in the police department meeting room and said, "There are cases that follow you. They walk out of the file room and they sit down at your kitchen table and they eat breakfast with you every morning for the rest of your life. The Hendricks case is one of mine. It always will be." He did not elaborate. He did not need to. It would be easy to close this story with a tidy moral, to conclude that Thomas Roberson was a hypocrite, a man who preached grace but dispensed none, to conclude that Linda Hendricks was a monster, to conclude that Cassidy was simply a victim, to file everything away under its appropriate label and move on. But real life rarely fits the label. Tracy Roberson was murdered by a man who had convinced himself, on the basis of nothing, that she was unfaithful. There was no affair. There was only a medical condition, an obsessive mind, a loaded gun, and 15 bullets. Cassidy killed her mother. She was 11 years old, had been abused for years, had asked for help through every channel available to a child of her age, and had been failed by every single one of them, and she acted out of a terror so deep and immediate that it has no adequate name in ordinary language. Thomas Roberson knew about Cassidy. He had been told. He had the power and the legal obligation to act. He chose instead to pray, record it in a journal, and do nothing. None of this fits neatly. What this case illuminates more than anything else is not the evil of one man or the tragedy of one child. It illuminates the catastrophic cost of silence, the price paid when people in positions of trust, pastors, social workers, teachers, neighbors, see.
If you want to uncover more chilling true crime stories and see justice exposed, subscribe to Crime Vaults as we bring light to the darkest true crime cases and never miss the secrets hidden in plain sight.